Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
All right, well, welcome everyone to this week's episode of the Examined Life with Phil. And this week I have a special guest with me. It's Michael Jones, who's the founder of the YouTube channel and group Inspiring Philosophy. How are you doing today, Michael?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you very much for being here. I invited Michael to come on because he recently put out 2 videos on his channel on heaven and hell, and I think that'd be a worthwhile topic to talk about here. If you recall, a couple weeks ago, I talked about how pretty much every worldview, philosophy, or system has things that are apparent problems or apparent cracks. And the problem of hell, or why would a loving God send people to hell, is one of those apparent problems with Christianity. Now, I think it's only an apparent problem that when you dig a little deeper, it kind of goes away. And that's why I wanted Michael to come on and talk about it, because his videos did a very good job of presenting a possible solution to that. So first of all, Michael, for listeners who aren't familiar with you and what you do, tell us a bit about yourself and what you do on YouTube and things like that.
Well, thanks. Well, what I basically do is I'm trying to build a library of videos to have an Christian apologetic answer for every question out there. So I'm going through numerous different topics. Specifically, what I focused on mostly is arguments for God's existence, defending the resurrection, New Testament reliability. So I've been doing that for a while. My next video will still be in the current series I'm working on. It'll be on the problem of evil, and then I'll do the problem of divine hiddenness after that, and so on. So my goal is to just keep doing more and more videos on various apologetic questions out there. So I'll jump around from numerous topics.
Fantastic, yeah. And I can say, as somebody, I've watched many of your videos online for a long time, that they're very, very high quality. You really do your research and know what you're talking about. In fact, when I was finishing my master's thesis in philosophy, I wrote on the modal ontological argument, and I actually watched a couple of your videos on it to get references to where I could go find more information. So
nice.
Thanks for that.
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that.
So yeah, if you aren't familiar with what Michael does with Inspiring Philosophy and you like doing or listening to topics in apologetics and philosophy, go look up his channel. There's a lot of good stuff there. Even if you don't think he gets everything right, he really does his research, and they're well-produced videos. Definitely worth your time to go listen to. So, all right, so moving on, I like to ask a frivolous question for fun. And I heard you mention in, it was either a discussion or debate you were having with somebody one time, that you like to drink whiskey when you're debating people. Is that true?
Yes, that's entirely true. I have a really nice whiskey collection over here.
Fantastic. So as a guy who likes whiskey and scotch myself, then I want to ask you, what do you usually drink, and what would you prefer to drink if that's not the same thing?
Yeah, I bounce around, but I'll save up money and I'll buy a really nice bottle. So I just bought a bottle of Glenlivet. I got a bottle of Macallan for Christmas.
Nice.
So I've got some nice scotches here. I have a really good Taiwanese whiskey sometimes I'll drink, but typically what I will go to is like a rye whiskey. I really do like rye whiskeys a lot, so I got a couple here.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. I really like Glenlivet and Macallan myself. My wife, when we were dating, the first Valentine's Day we were together, she bought me a bottle of Glenlivet 12. And if I'd had any doubts before that we were meant to be together, they were all gone then. So
yeah, I actually have one of those bottles right here with me.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, let's move on a little bit then. For listeners who haven't watched your videos, I would encourage you, if you haven't done that, go to his channel on YouTube, just type a search in for Inspiring Philosophy and watch his videos on heaven and hell. He just put them up recently because that's what we're going to be talking about. So with regard to, we'll just start with the video on hell, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So with regard to that one, I kind of thought that there's a quote from C.S. Lewis you have at the end that seems to summarize the whole view that you're taking there, and it's, there are only 2 kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and those to whom God says in the end, "Thy will be done." All that are in hell choose it. Without self-choice, there could be no hell. So to help people who haven't watched the video or don't have the time, could you kind of unpack what that means and what you're getting at by that?
Yeah, I think hell is a continuation of sin itself. We
Hmm.
understand sin is the rejection of God, the rejection of God's plan for us. It's they want to be the Lord of their own life. They want to still rule as they would do, as they would say. And so, what does God do in those situations? Well, if you look in Scripture, when Cain did it, or when the Table of Nations at Babel did that, he exiled them. So that's what hell is. Hell is just the exile, God exiling people away from Him, giving them what they've always wanted. And
Hmm.
so, of course, it's going to be torturous because we know that the Bible teaches that without God, who is life, it's a living hell, pun intended. It's
Hmm.
exactly what it is. So they may not want God. They may think they can live better without God. But ultimately, by rejecting God, they're going to create their own hell around them. And so I think this quote just perfectly sums up what happens when you reject Christ. You create your own hell. So that's what hell is. Hell, God doesn't need to inflict more pain upon these people. They're basically just going to punish themselves, destroy themselves very slowly because they've rejected God. And I think this quote sums up very nicely what hell is.
Okay, okay. So then it would follow that God doesn't really send people to hell in the sense that I would send my daughter to time out, right?
No, not necessarily. I mean,
Okay.
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. In that sense, God does sort of, he doesn't really send people to hell because people choose it. People
Hmm.
openly walk into hell. But I mean, he says, if you want to come into the kingdom, if you want to come where I'm at, you have to, you have to give your life to me. You have to allow me to guide you. You have to allow me to change you. And people don't want to do that. So he says, well, fine, you can depart from me. And of course, they're like, yeah, I'm going to depart from you. So they basically leave on mutual agreement. God would send them away anyway, but he's sending them away because they don't want life. They don't want the truth. They don't want the light, who is Christ.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. So then it would be, oh, I lost my train of thought there. So you did something really, I thought, good in the video, which is you use the Christ parable of Lazarus and the rich man to help illustrate this. So
Mm-hmm.
how does that help illustrate or point us toward this? I guess we could call it choice model of hell.
Well, notice a lot of what happens in this parable. The
Hmm.
rich man is making arguments, trying to debate with Abraham. So he has a lot of opportunities to ask to get out of hell. Never once does he ask to get out of hell. This is a parable, so Christ could have depicted him as asking to get out of hell. He could have, depicted him as begging to sort of have a way across the chasm, but he doesn't. And I think Christ does that on purpose to illustrate that the people in hell don't want to get out. The rich man only asks to get Lazarus into hell. He wants Lazarus to come be his servant and bring him water. And I think he does
Hmm.
that on purpose to illustrate that the doors of hell are locked from the inside. They
Hmm.
may be suffering there. They may not like their situation, but they prefer that than having to submit to a higher power. It's like that old saying, I'd rather reign in hell than serve in heaven. Hell may,
Hmm.
hell may be a horrible place, but it's far better than having to serve some god up there.
Yeah, I've always found it a little ironic that people say I'd rather reign in hell and serve in heaven in a positive context when it's from Paradise Lost and it's Satan who's saying that. So,
Yeah, well, I mean that goes back to the original sin in Genesis 3. Adam and Eve were
mhm.
taught by Satan that you should be your own gods, and that's what hell is. It's filled with gods. It's filled with everyone who knows they are God.
Mm. Okay, that makes a that makes a great deal of sense. So, what you're kind of getting at is, uh, again, I lost my train of thought.
no,
So what
no
you're
worries.
so what you're getting at there is it's not that people go to hell because God punishes them in the same sense that I punish my daughter by sending her to timeout, but rather they go there by their choice. It's like more of like what we would call a natural progression of their actions and what they want, in the same way that, like, well, you and I both like drinking whiskey.
Exactly.
If we drink too much, we're going to have some problems, and that's just a natural progression of if we drink too much.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just simply the natural consequences of sin playing out.
Okay, okay. Now, there is that part of the story there, excuse me, of Christ's parable, where the rich man says, if you just send somebody back, somebody rises from the dead. That that'll make my brothers believe, and then they won't go to hell. And you had a particular point you made about that. What was that?
Oh, well, what specific part? I mean, there was a couple different parts I made about that.
Oh, I
Is
don't
it about?
recall. I don't.
One of
Go
the
ahead.
things to get the gain from it is the fact that it's sort of like a blame shifting thing. There's an
Okay.
insinuation of blame shifting there. He says, I want someone to come down here and cool my tongue. Well, we're not going to do that. Well, then fine. You should go give my brothers the correct information so they don't end up like me. What's
Mhm.
that? Hint, hint. I didn't get enough information. No one didn't take care of me in real life, and I really shouldn't be here. Really, it's God's fault, and so much you better warn my brothers so they don't end up like me. I mean,
Mhm.
it's a total insinuation of blame shifting. The idea that it's still God's fault I'm here. If he really loved me, he would have given me someone rising from the dead to warn me of this. And Abraham responds appropriately that would never have worked. Because if you didn't listen to Moses and the prophets, why would you have listened to someone rising from the dead? It's
Mhm.
not more miracles we need. It's a change of the heart. That's truly what changes people.
Yeah, that reminds me of what Bertrand Russell said when he was asked, well, if you die and you go meet God, what are you going to say to him? And he said something like, well, I'd say to him, sir, you didn't give me enough evidence.
Yeah, it's always the blame shifting on God.
Mhm.
It's God's fault. Many other atheists have said the exact same thing, like Dan Barker or Christopher Hitchens. He compared heaven to a celestial North Korea.
Yeah,
Obviously, he
I
doesn't want
listened to
to be
the
there.
debate where he did that. It was just kind of shocking and yet not surprising at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, no one wants to. All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, it wouldn't be hell.
Hmm. I've also kind of thought about that aspect of this parable, that there's kind of I guess, a more meta irony going on there in that, the rich man is insisting if somebody comes back from the dead, people will believe, and yet the storyteller is Christ, who later on does return from the dead, and yet people still don't believe.
Right, exactly. Modern psychology has noted people tend to bend evidence to what they want to be true. It's something
Hmm.
we all do. It's something we all need to recognize. It's something we all need to fight. So if that's the case, then we need to realize that just throwing more evidence at people who already hate God, who already want to be God, who've already rejected God, it's not going to change them. It's not going to really make them worship God, because even the demons believe and they tremble, but they don't
Hmm.
repent. They don't try to get right with God. They still fight against him because it's not more evidence people need. It's a change of the heart.
Yeah, okay. That makes see, that's all making good sense to me. I've had very similar thoughts about what to do about hell to the choice model you put out in your video for quite some time. So,
Hmm.
um, so I'm probably kind of already convinced of that. So,
Right.
does it an aspect of this that I've been thought that I kind of like to try to explore is it that we're becoming not just less Christ-like as we move away from God and move toward our own arrogance, thinking of ourselves as God, but we could, in a certain sense, be becoming even less human, to the point where maybe people who are in hell don't even have the human essence that, like, you and I have anymore, like they once did, but it's just gone. Have you
I would
run
I
across
would
things
say
like that?
so.
Or
Yeah, I would say so. I think that's sort of what happens to hell. There's always an objection that I've gotten from atheists that how could I go to heaven when I know my mother and my father are in hell? I would never enjoy myself as I would be worrying about them. And you have to think about it like this. So if you have abusive parents who just are raging alcoholics, who just want to beat you, steal your money, use drugs, how long before you excommunicate them, before you push them out of your life because you realize they're just harming you, they're just using you? Everything you once loved about them is already dead.
mm-hmm.
That's what hell is. That's what people in hell have become. They've become the worst possible form of themselves. And so there's no point in keeping them around because they're just there to torture us now. We may still love them. We may regret what they've become, but we realize being around with them, worrying about them, is only going to drag us down to hell. And so the mature thing, the right thing to do is to move on from those people. And that's what people do in heaven when their loved ones are in hell. We realize the light, everything we loved about them, has been dwindled, it's been snuffed out. There's nothing left of that. And so we move on and we build our identity in what truly matters, who is God, who gives us far more fulfillment than these earthly people ever could.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, That makes sense to me. I like doing ties to like literature and other stories, and that idea kind of reminds me of Gollum from Lord of the Rings and his relation to the ring, where if you, and I'm pretty sure Tolkien did this on purpose, where if you, can't even really say I anymore. He always says we and other plural things like that, because he's been so consumed by the ring that he's either lost or is in the process of losing his own identity. And
Exactly.
that sounds very similar to what you're talking about there.
Exactly. It's those people throw themselves into the fire because they're chasing something they never should have to begin with. And that's what happens to Smeagol.
Okay. You're pretty familiar with that story, I take it, like so many other people are?
I think I've probably read the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings like 3 to 4 times now. So yeah.
Oh, you're way ahead of me then. So that's great.
Oh yeah. Let me talk to you about the lore, sir.
I'm sure you've got me very beat on that. I haven't taken the time to read all those as thoroughly as I should, but
Well,
I
no one's
really
perfect.
enjoy the stories.
Yeah, well, no one's perfect.
Yeah, that's me. I'm not perfect. So kind of building from that, I think you said something in the video about how we need to have a different definition of sin than just breaking the rules, and you referred to Kierkegaard and what he said about that.
Right. I think we need to realize that the Bible teaches sin is far more than just following a rule book. I mean, this is one of the things that the prophets like Amos, Hosea, Malachi are all talking about. You know, you're just following the rituals. You're just you're making sacrifices, but your heart is not pure. Your heart is not in the right place. And so one of the things I think that we're seeing in that, and we're seeing in the book of Romans and Galatians, and what Jesus is trying to teach in the Sermon on the Mount is, it's not so much about just doing good things or thinking you're following the rule book. You have to love God. Your entire identity has to be built on God. It doesn't have to be about, I'm going to use this rule book God has given me to earn the reward of some sort of like paradise in the sky type thing. You're using God as a means to an end. That's not building your identity on God. You're still sinning because you're still putting yourself first. It's still about you and your own pride, your own self-worth. You're using the rule book to try to manipulate God to get rewards out of him. And that's not how it works.
Yeah, that's more in line with what the Pharisees did that Christ was calling them out on.
Exactly.
Okay. So then I've had this idea I've been kind of kicking around philosophically for a while, that if we think of being in the sense of we all have different senses of being, and God is ultimate being. And I was talking to somebody last week, and the analogy I used is God is being with a capital B. He's the ultimate. Then you and I have being, but not anywhere near the degree that God does. My dog has some being, but it'd be significantly less than what you and I have because he's even more removed. And then you go down to a rock, it has some being, but not near as much as my dog, and so on and so forth. So if we could think about it something like that very loosely, then it seems like we could call sin something that's the opposite of being. It's like a null or void act, something that's that's contrary to the very nature of existence.
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to put it. I mean, it kind of relates to the idea of privatio boni, that evil is just a lack of good. It's a lack of that which is. So when we do evil, it's not a thing. It's just removing good from our soul.
Yeah. When I first heard that idea, was it Augustine who first proposed that?
Privatio boni, yeah. It was Augustine who proposed it, but he of course, was building on earlier thinkers like, obviously Moses and obviously people like even the Greek thinkers like Plato and Socrates. And so, he was building, of course, on a lot of different ideas. And I thought he was pretty spot on with that.
Yeah, that was, well, it's a little muddy whether it was Socrates or Plato who said it, but they thought that all evil was just ignorance. So,
right.
Yeah. Okay. So this would be, hang on. There we go. It's a little harder to make everything work since I'm not in my office. I'm in my wife's office today. But
oh, no worries.
Okay. So then when people go to hell and they're essentially have been pursuing these acts that are contrary to existence, contrary to being, contrary to God, I guess the example that comes to my mind is it's a bit like how a bad habit like drug addiction, it's often kept in check by an addict's lack of resources. I've heard somebody say, most people who are addicts are very blessed that they don't have any resources, because if you give them a lot of resources or unlimited resources, they're going to be dead in a day, because they'll just quickly self-destruct, because that'll consume them, where their lack of resources prevents it from consuming them, at least for a little while. So if I just pursue my own selfish tendencies forever, and then that's allowed to continue unchecked for all eternity, at some point there's going to be nothing good left in me, perhaps not even anything human.
Yeah, there will be no you left, just as C.S. Lewis says, just the grumble going on forever like a machine.
Okay, yeah. Well, as I said, this seems like a pretty sensible and even very biblical model of hell to me. Obviously, I'm sure you're aware of some of the other traditional models, like the traditional view that says people must be punished because justice demands it, and that divine love is subordinate to divine justice, or annihilationism or universalism. Do you have any comments on those other models, or why you think they won't work? Or?
Let's talk about the divine punishment one first. The idea that God has to be punishing people in hell because he's a good, he's a just God. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, yeah, I agree. God is going to punish sin. The Bible directly tells us what punishment is going to be given for sin. Romans 6, the wages of sin is eternal torment in hell. No, the wages of sin is death. The wages of sin is death. It's not eternal torment in hell. God never says that in the Bible anywhere, that because you've sinned, therefore you deserve eternal suffering in a flame because of that. If you read the Old Testament, sure, God punishes sinners in this life, ultimately leading to death. Never once does that continue beyond death, because we are told directly the wages of sin is death. The only other punishment that is specifically mentioned, other than people being punished in this life or death, is exile. Adam and Eve, exiled. Cain, exiled. The nations at Babel, exiled. Israel, exiled. That's what hell is. Hell is death followed by exile. So where on earth do we get this idea that God has to be punishing and torturing people in hell for all eternity? That's not taught. What we are taught is that the wages of sin is death. Even Wayne Grudem is a very conservative Calvinistic scholar, and he wrote like a 1,000-page book on systematic theology. But he gets to this point, and he even has to admit page 1151 that hell, the problem is that he quotes David Kingdon, and he says, David Kingdon, also responds to this objection by suggesting that unbelievers in hell may go on sinning and receiving punishments for their sin, but never repenting. And then notes that Revelations 22 points in this direction, where it says, let the evildoer still do evil, and let the filthy still be filthy. So even a very conservative Calvinistic scholar admits that the wages of sin is death. And the reason people are still in hell is because they're still evil. They still remain there because they don't want to repent and change.
So it's not that it's too late. It's that it doesn't matter. They don't want to.
Exactly. I mean, 2 Thessalonians 1:9 talks about punishment. And he says this, they will suffer the punishment of eternal destruction, away from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his might. So Paul directly tells us what hell is. It's punishment by exile.
That seems to fit to me. I'd never drawn that connection from that verse before, but yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's how God punishes people. Death, exile. Sometimes he will try to correct people in this life, as the book of Hebrews says, but it's not. There's never this idea that it's some sort of this eternal flame is the wages of sin. The wages of sin is death. There's no more punishment needed beyond that.
Okay, that makes sense to me. I got my undergraduate degree in English, and so we studied a lot of good literature like Paradise Lost and things along those lines. And as we were going through studying it occurred to me most of the imagery and ideas that about hell that seem to exist in popular culture and even in the church actually seem to come more from things like Paradise Lost and Dante's Inferno than they do from the Bible.
Exactly. It's. I mean, the funny thing about Dante's Inferno, I love when people cite that. Dante has a whole section of hell for people who loan money with interest, because in his day that was a mortal sin. You didn't loan money with interest. That's the basis of our capitalistic society now. So it's obviously not a sin, but in that day it was. So there's a whole section of hell devoted to people who loan money with interest.
Yeah, there's a lot of funny tidbits like that in the Inferno where,
yeah. It's come on. That should not be the basis of our theology.
Yeah, and I can get how if you're just growing up and haven't like researched it, haven't started thinking about it deeply, those kind of things just seep into your thinking from popular level culture. I immediately saw what had happened to me when we started reading Paradise Lost. But how is it that people who are claiming to take this seriously then turn around and do that? That I don't get. So
I don't know. Even the most conservative scholars I've read, like Jerry Walls, for example, will note that hell and fire is metaphorical for the souls that burn themselves out there. It's described as an outer darkness. It's described as a fire. You can't have both of those things in a literal sense. Obviously, these are metaphors that describe things otherworldly.
Another objection that I've heard that this just came to me just now, but I've heard people will claim things like, you can't take systematic theology from a parable of Christ because it's a story he made up to serve a point. Like, I would be reluctant to cite that parable and claim, well, there really was a Lazarus and a rich man, because it seems to me, well, more than likely Christ just made up this story to illustrate the point. So how would you want to respond to people who would then say, take that further and claim, well, you can't really draw very many systematic conclusions about hell from his parable then?
Well, I mean,
just take a vague general point.
Well, right. I mean, they're basically stories to illustrate a point. I don't actually think this actually literally took place where Abraham had a conversation with a guy. But that doesn't mean there's not a lot of theology built into these parables. That's one of the basic points of these, is it's filled with theology. And there are other places where hell is confirmed. I mean, Paul obviously confirms it in multiple places, like 2 Thessalonians, where I just talked about it. So, yeah, there is theology we have to derive from it. But, I mean, and obviously we don't take everything way too literal. I think that'd be one of the points I would be making, because they're parables.
Okay. Yeah. I agree with you. I just wanted to see, give you a chance to respond to that for people who might have that question in their minds. And I think that, like you're saying, that's kind of the whole reason Christ told parables was to make theological points, was to teach, not to obscure and make everything vague and really esoteric. So, okay.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. Well, let's move on to like the annihilationist view then, which says that, well, maybe people go to hell for a while, but eventually God wipes them out, or they're all wiped out on death or something along those lines. There's some variance, but
right. So this of course I think contradicts God's nature. God is life. He will give people life. He will make people new. He doesn't destroy. He doesn't come to wipe souls out. He is the giver of life. So, and this is also more or less God sort of giving the non-believer what they want. I hear from a lot of atheists that when they die, they want to be annihilated out of existence. And God has to do that for them because that's what they want. So they inevitably want to reverse the role still. They want to be God, and the real God has to do what they want, given to their demands, annihilate them out of existence. So I think the problem with annihilationism is there's really nothing that it says about it that would be truly justice. People just die, they go out of existence, end of story, let's all move on. But there's no real justice there. There's no exile. There's no God taking care of these people saying, you're going to go into exile because you've rejected me. If you want to be annihilated out of existence, go for it. You have to find your own way. I'm God. If you wanted to come with me, I would give you a far better life. I'm not going to do your dirty work. You do it. I don't want to annihilate out of existence. I want you to come into the kingdom. So I think annihilationism gives the non-believer what they want. It turns them into God. And I don't think that's fair, especially when God, we do hear about God talking about justice. And the justice he gives is death in exile, not annihilationism.
Yeah, and I agree. And not even to mention that there just really isn't any scriptural or biblical support for that idea. I mean, the other ones that I think are mistaken, you can at least somewhat see how somebody might read some passages in scripture and come to that conclusion. But with this one, I just can't even find anything that even remotely points in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it's it just does away with the justice of God. It doesn't make God who he truly is, which is a God of justice and love.
Yeah, we could think what's more just for people like Hitler and Stalin, that on death they cease to exist, or that they go into some type of hell.
Exactly. They get what they deserve. In the end, everyone gets what they deserve. They get well, we don't. We're lucky we don't get what we deserve. But all those in hell get what they want, and they get what they deserve.
Yeah, okay. Well, then the other one that's pretty common is universalism. And I know this one I personally feel, even though I don't agree with it, I feel a little sympathetic toward it. And I know there's actually, I would say, a minority viewpoint in church history where many people have claimed universalism. I can remember about 3 or 4 years ago, I was talking on a plane to a guy. My wife and I were flying back from Montana, and he was very interested in Christianity and philosophy, and we were having all kinds of good discussions about all these things. And one of the main things that was keeping him back was he was saying, well, I just don't see how God could, it was the problem of hell. I don't see how God could, condemn anyone to hell. I want to think he saves everybody. And so I kind of said, well, I don't think I agree with that, but you should be aware that there have been people throughout church history who've said the same thing. Now, I might think they're wrong, but if that's your only objection, you should just go read some of the Universalists and commit yourself to Christ. And I don't know if he ever did, because I never talked to him again. But so this one, as I said, I'm kind of sympathetic toward it. And I think anybody who is not a cold-hearted, awful person would at least want to be sympathetic toward it. So what do you think?
Well, I mean, even God is sympathetic towards it because, First Peter says he wants none to perish. So he's obviously sympathetic to this idea. I think the problem with universalism is it's an attempt to make God more loving that ultimately makes God less loving. To quote C.S. Lewis from The Problem of Pain, he says, I would pay any price to be able to say truthfully, all will be saved. But my reason retorts, without their will or with it? If I say without their will, I at once perceive a contradiction. How can the supreme voluntary act of self-surrender be involuntary? If I say with their will, my reason replies, how if they will not give in? So the problem with this is it just turns us all into dolls, turns us all into robots. God eventually just forces us into heaven. Or if he doesn't, then there's just people who just openly reject and go into hell because they hate God. This is what Dan Barker says. If he dies and realizes that God exists, he would tell him to go to hell. So if we are free, people are willingly going to go to hell on their own accord. But if God forces them into heaven, well, then you've turned God into an insecure parent who just wants to protect everyone, never gives freedom, never truly loves us. What do you think is a good parent? A parent who keeps their kid in their room for their entire life, never lets him out because they don't want anything bad to happen to them. Or the parent who lets their child grow up and make their own life decisions. We obviously understand that it's a far better parent, a far better person. And that's who God is. God gives us our freedom, gives us our choices. He loves us. He wants us to make the right choices. But he understands that true love, true relationship has to be done through freedom. He can't force us to do it. And that'll be the subject of my next video on the problem of evil.
Okay. Well, I'll be looking forward to that. Yeah, I've actually heard a couple of psychologists talking about that, about how the best thing you can do as a parent for your children is not to protect them from everything, but to actually expose them to things that might hurt them in ways where you can step in and rescue them before it kills them. Because one day you're not going to be there, and then that thing might actually kill them then. It's you don't want to be the helicopter parent. You want to be the parent who can lend a hand, but not somebody who's always there handling everything.
Yeah, I mean, universalism is a nice idea on the surface, but when you think about it, it really just makes God less loving. It makes him less secure, less powerful. It really just diminishes the God of the Bible.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you there. What about, I think I've heard some variants of universalism where the idea is, well, people go to hell, but eventually God's love is so overpowering that they change their minds and grow and sort of come back to being more Christ-like, being anyway. I think that was the argument that Rob Bell gave in his very, very muddled book from about 10 years ago, if I remember correctly.
I hope I mean, who doesn't hope that's right? The problem is A, there's no scriptural support for such an idea.
Mm-hmm.
And B, we don't know ultimately. I mean, only God knows the hearts of those in hell. I mean, it's possible that could happen, but given human nature, given what we already know about people and how stubborn and prideful we are, I highly doubt that'll happen. I don't think Satan would ever bend the knee to God again. I think he's very bent on just destroying the kingdom as much as he possibly can. Even though it ultimately fail, he'll never bend his knee, and that's all that he needs to know.
Okay. That makes sense to me. So, okay. Well, moving on a bit, you talked in the video about how this can potentially at least answer the problem of religious pluralism. And for listeners who don't know, the problem of religious pluralism is essentially, what about people who don't know? So an example I think I've used before is, let's say there's a guy who lived in a Mayan society in 400 AD. There's obviously no way he could have ever heard about Christ. And you can find other examples that are similar to that. And let's say this guy seemed to, by as much accounts as we can get, live as best as he could and really try to do right by those around him. Now, is he going to go to hell? And so you offer some possible solutions to that problem in the video from the choice model.
Right, but before I do that, I want to recommend a book on something like this. It's called "In the Beginning: A Fresh Look at the Case for Original Monotheism" by Winfred Cordon. It's a great book. What he does is he argues that based on a lot of data from anthropology, that the most primitive and earliest cultures were monotheistic, and they actually have a lot of good evidence for that. He quotes an early scholar by the name of Andrew Lang who advocated this, who wasn't a Christian, wasn't even a theist. He was even arguing that the original religion was monotheism. So that might somehow tie into this idea that God has sort of revealed himself to all these other cultures, even though we were not aware of it. So great book. I'm going to eventually do some videos on it, but I need to do some more research. I need to read a guy called Wilhelm Schmidt before I do that.
Okay, I'll be looking forward to that. I've heard of that book, but I haven't actually read it myself yet. So
it's a great book. I highly recommend it. I learned a lot from it. But so Christ actually answers this question. So he's, indirectly, he says in John 9:41 and John 15:22 that if I had not come, they would not be guilty. But now that I have come, they have no excuse. And he was talking about the Pharisees. So he basically just points out people are not condemned to hell, or they're not exiled from God for lack of information. Never says anything like that. So this idea that, someone may never have heard the gospel, they're therefore going to be thrown into a pit of fire for nothing, for something they didn't even know, is just absurd. The Bible never claims that. It never says that. It extends grace to all who want it. But everyone still has to make that choice if they want to be their own God or if they want to surrender to the only God that there is. And so we don't know the whole process that goes into that, but we know that God is just, God is fair. He will judge people on the information they get, and he's not going to throw people into a pit of fire. I don't even think that's literally what he's talking about, but he's not going to exile people based on bad information. He'll give everyone the proper choice. And that's why we spread the gospel, because giving people better information is going to help them make better choices. Hiding the information from them is not going to help them make better choices.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. And that's without even getting into various types of natural theology, which argue that, in line with what it says in Romans, that you can be pretty well assured, as much of anything, that there's a God that exists just from looking around and paying attention. Because even though they can get very, very sophisticated, and I love looking at the sophisticated versions, that's ultimately what all those philosophical arguments for God are really trying to claim, is you don't necessarily need a religious experience or a revelation to know God's there, and you need to do something about it.
Exactly. And there's enough information people can look in what they get. And God, again, will judge people based on what they knew and what was available to them. He doesn't condemn people to hell for lack of information. That's never claimed.
Yeah. And so, practically speaking, what I've done with people who've asked me some tough questions, like I think an example somebody posited to me is somebody who was, say, horribly, horribly abused by all outward indications, didn't seem to know Christ, and then killed themselves or something pretty horrible like that. They would say, well, how would it be just for God to condemn that person to hell? And I would say, well, kind of like similar to what you're saying, I don't know the specifics of how all this works out, but what I can tell you is a God who's going to get himself crucified just to give people a chance isn't going to just then condemn people to a life eternity in hell by an accident of birth or a happenstance that they were mistreated. You can trust that a God who's willing to go through that is going to deal with them in the most just and loving way that he possibly could.
Exactly. And it's also a lot of non-omniscient people trying to question what an omniscient God can do. Well, we don't have the same information as God, so how could we know?
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, are you aware of any problems or potential problems or objections to this choice model of hell? Anything that gives you pause?
The only thing I think would have given me pause is what we just kind of went over about is the people who may have never heard of God. But I think the only response to that is just it's beyond our knowledge because we're not omniscient.
Mm-hmm. So you go well, it's not quite the same thing as skeptical theism, but is pushing a little bit in that direction then.
Kind of, yeah. I mean, Obviously we can't know. Like same idea with the problem of evil. There's a lot of issues with the problem of evil we don't know because we're not omniscient. We don't see the whole picture, so we can't know what God would know in those types of situations.
Okay, that makes a great deal of sense to me. Okay, so in doing a little bit of research, going back through some notes and stuff to prepare for talking to you, one objection I came across that I think might possibly work is, and I'll just build up to it here. We would want to maybe distinguish between what I'm going to call natural and artificial punishments. And so a natural punishment would be like the example I said earlier of us drinking too much whiskey and then having problems. Or if you stand a little too close to a volcano when it's going off, try and pet a tiger, things like that. You're going to have problems, but those are just a natural result of your actions when you do that. Mm-hmm. Whereas artificial punishments are things more like when when I've had to pay fines for speeding, or if somebody gets banned from a online video game for cheating in it, things along those lines where it's not necessarily the natural result of their actions. It's something that's imposed by culture, society, or some type of authority. And so the problem, it seems to me then, is that Scripture seems to present hell, God's wrath, punishment, more in the context of being an artificial punishment that he actively does, rather than it just being the natural result of our own actions, the natural consequence of me pursuing my own selfish ends of being anti-God and anti-being. So have you come across that objection? What would you say to that?
I mean, typically when people say that to me, I ask them for the scripture references, and then we go over them, and it doesn't really say what they think it says. I mean, it's typically talking about how God is going to, he'll pour his wrath upon people. Well, how? Well, I mean, again, scripture clarifies it's through death and exile. It's not through, it's not through God having to poke people with pitchforks in a pit of fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so, I could cite some. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, you can go ahead and cite some. We can go through them. I'm okay doing that.
Well, I don't really like going through and doing like proof texting because I don't think that's actually a very good way of doing theology or philosophy. It's just more that I'm saying I think if people read the scriptures, you can at least take that impression away. And so what I'm hearing your response is, well, but if I go through these individually, you're going to find that, sure, it might describe it in an active way, but then when you look at how it's happening, it's more in line with the natural punishment than the artificial one. I think that's what I think. If you get like a surface level reading, if you skim through it, you could come away with the artificial reading. But I think if you really delve into it, if you look at what's happening in Revelation, if you look at what happens in Romans, it's more of God. He exiles people and they destroy themselves eventually. I think that's very clear in 2 Thessalonians, for example. Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you there. I really don't like how a lot of theological debates happen where people will do essentially proof texting like that, where they'll say, well, I have these 3 or 4 verses that give this position, and somebody else comes back and says, no, my 3 or 4 verses destroy your position. And I'm kind of like, well, maybe we should try and read the whole and come up with a conclusion from the whole instead of picking up bits and pieces like that, which is why I'm not really inclined to then throw you a bunch of verses about this and let you respond individually. I think it's kind of a waste of time to do things like that.
Right, I agree.
Okay. So the choice model of hell that you're presenting here, I think that seems to directly kind of tie into the model of heaven that you presented in your video on heaven. And as I understood it, the idea is that when we move into heaven, we're continually becoming more Christ-like. That is, we're moving more toward that ultimate being. So in heaven, as you and I progress toward being more like God, we would have more being, obviously never like God, but we would become more in that sense. Does that more or less capture what your video on heaven is, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we need to understand what is actually taking place in heaven, heaven is layered in a lot of ways. So when we die, we go to be with Christ, but that's temporary because we wait for the resurrection, and that's when true heaven really begins. But that doesn't happen right away. A lot of people get kind of confused. They think that this is somehow merged, or when you talk to people that have not really looked into a lot of this, they sort of mix the ideas up. You'll see people quoting for things in the end of the book of Revelations to talk about what happens immediately when we die. And I have to say, well, no, that happens after the resurrection. It's not something immediately. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, when you and I die, we're still going to be us, but we'll be with Christ. So we're still going to be becoming more Christ-like, being sanctified, being made holy, being made whole. That's not just going to be magically transferred once we die. We're still going to be continuing in this process of wanting to get to know God more, to becoming more like him as much as we possibly can. So I think that's what heaven is. Heaven is shedding off more of your self-centered tendencies. It's wanting to become more like God. It's wanting to learn what it is to truly give yourself to God, something that we only have a glimpse of in this life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that reminds me of something where at a conference about 3 or 4 years ago, I was talking to one of my old philosophy professors who's a Christian, and he was talking about how he didn't think that he had enough time in life for God to deal with certain aspects of his character that weren't good yet, where he was like, well, I think God's going to deal with me and help me become more Christ-like in a few areas, but there's some other things where that's just going to have to wait until we are in heaven.
Exactly. And I think that's what's going to happen for a lot of us. I think we think we're probably further along than we really are. And we'll learn
Yes.
once we get there that we still have a long way to go. Luckily, we have an eternity to get there. So I'm not really worried about, getting there on a time limit.
Yeah. That reminds me that before I met my wife and got married, I thought I was a pretty good guy who mostly had things together other than a few minor details. And then after living with somebody who knows me pretty well, I realized, that wasn't true at all. I was deceiving myself pretty well.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, how does this model of heaven then, would this be in conflict with, say, variants of Christianity that deny free will, like some of the more extreme versions of Calvinism and things like that?
I think it would. I think it's really hard to be a Christian and deny free will. I don't know how people do it. If there is no free will, what's the point of all this? What's the point of evil? Is God just having fun? Is he determining, children to get rape? No, I mean, God is very clear in the book of Jeremiah when it talks about people sacrificing their children. God says to Jeremiah, I didn't want that. That never even came into my mind. Why would I do that? Like, obviously, God is not causing these evil actions. He's not determining people. We have our free will, and that's where evil comes from. So I really don't understand how people could deny something that just seems so basic in the scriptures. I mean, even I was reading Clay Jones, and he quoted John Calvin. Even John Calvin didn't reject free will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's there's certain things that have always seemed to me when they're so apparent and obvious, not just to you, but to almost everyone else, then if somebody wants to be skeptical of that, they have an obligation to give you some very, very good and strong arguments in opposition to that. Like you and I are talking over the internet right now. If somebody wanted to convince you, no, that's not happening, you're deceived in some way, you're in the Matrix or something like that, well, you can't totally rule that out in the absolute logical sense, but I think somebody would have to give you some very, very exceptionally strong arguments to make you doubt what's immediately apparent to you. And free will has just always seemed immediately apparent.
Right. The burden has always been on the determinist.
Say what? Say again? I'm sorry?
The burden is on the determinist to show we don't have free will.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there, yeah. If it's something that's just so immediately obvious to me and so many other people, then you just need to give me exceptionally strong arguments to show it's the other way around. So, okay. So how would, this is something you mentioned in the video, that we're going to be praising God for all eternity, and a lot of people come against that because we're all going to be in church services, and as somebody who's grown up in church services, I can tell you, and I still go, but I can tell you, I wouldn't want to spend all of my eternal life in church services either. And you talked about that a little bit, about how it's not going to be like we're all sitting in church singing praise songs, but it's going to be something significantly different and better.
Right. Well, I think, as an introvert, I definitely would not want to sit in church forever. That would not be fun at all. I think the problem is that we are looking at this as if it's sort of like a ritual we do. Well, we go to church every Sunday, we have to praise God. But it's more than that, because when we are with Christ, we will become something more than that. We will really know what it means to love God. And as C.S. Lewis says, praise is just a natural flow of love. People praise what they love. They praise a wine, a good whiskey. They praise their spouse. They praise their kids for doing good accomplishments. They're not doing these things because they have to, but because they want to. When we're praising God in heaven, it will be because we want to. And I don't think it's just going to be singing. I mean, the Bible says, whatever we do, we should do for the glory of God. I think, all sorts of artistic ways can be praise for God. I think loving other people can be worship and praise for God. It's far beyond than just singing some hymns we've done a million times. So I think there will be singing, but I also think it's going to be far beyond that. And we don't really know what that's like yet, because we've not experienced true love for God at this point. We're still in these beginning phases of our existence. It's like trying to explain to a baby in the womb what it will be like when they finally see something. I mean, their eyes have been closed their entire existence. You'd have to describe it to them in terms of sounds that they would hear within the womb, and that's just not going to give it justice.
Yeah, that makes me think of a joke I heard. I think it was some philosopher say one time, where he said, two twins are in the womb arguing, is there life after birth? So.
Yep, and I think when we die, it's sort of like that. It's just entering a new state of consciousness.
Well, that makes sense. As I said earlier, I like tying all this theology and philosophy back to story examples, because I love stories, and I think that also helps people kind of get at more of the meat of it. People tend to learn better through stories than they do through systematic philosophy and theology, much to my disdain, because I love reading those things. But this reminds me of that scene in the movie 300 where the traitor's coming before Xerxes to tell him about the path that he can use to get behind the Spartans and take them out. And Xerxes says to the traitor that the cruel Greek gods and the Spartans demanded that he stand, but Xerxes only demanded that he kneel. And I even remember thinking this the first time I saw the movie. I'm like, well, that's almost exactly like what it's like with God and Satan. God demands that we stand and try to be a little strong, and then he helps us through it with grace when we can't. Where Satan only demands that we just kneel to our own desires. And it's so much easier to just kneel than it is to stand.
Well, I mean, he told Christ to kneel on the hill instead of give him all the kingdoms of the world. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Christ calls for us to stand and to spread the gospel, to move from town to town, whereas Satan wanted us to simply to kneel and give in to whatever was the easiest. Christ came to say, came to bring war on this earth, to set mother against son, or mother-in-law against daughter-in-law, or whatnot. All those examples. So obviously, working for Christ can be hard. It's going to take sacrifice. It's going to take a lot of broken bones in a lot of ways. But ultimately, it will be better for us. Just like in the example you kind of gave, it ultimately leads to a better outcome. Yeah,
and I'm not under any illusion that like the filmmakers of that movie intended that message. It was more me kind of reading something into it, because there's definitely a lot of other parts of that movie that aren't Christ-like at all. But I just thought that was a really good illustration. So.
Right.
Okay. So, let's see. It seems to me that the best argument that I think is in favor of this choice model of heaven and hell is that it really directly appeals to the love and nature of God, in that, like C.S. Lewis said from the quote we started with at the beginning, we all get what we want. that due to his love for us, God gives himself to those of us who want him, but due to his love for us, he also refrains from forcing himself on those of us who don't want them. Well, don't want him. But an objection that I would then that would come to mind, and I know some other people would raise, is, well, then why would God turn around and create people who he knows are going to reject him and end up in hell? Why do that in the first place? Because God being omniscient, he would know that that's going to happen. So why not just create people who are going to follow him?
The question we need to ask is if it was even possible. I mean, a lot of people we interact with have affected us in our lives that ultimately have brought us to Christ and whatnot. People we may not even know or realize have affected us. So the question we need to ask is, was it even possible just to create a world where everyone always chooses heaven? And this is what I'll be going about in my next video on the problem of evil.
Okay.
I don't think it would have been possible, because if it was, God would have done that, being a good, just, and loving God. So, I'll use the example of Avengers Infinity Wars. Doctor Strange looks into the future 14 million times and realizes there's only one outcome where they save the universe and half of all universe is not wiped out. But that way resulted in a lot of death, a lot of misery, a lot of pain. A lot of people were going to have to die before they could get to that point. And so I think that's what God kind of does as well. He's working with human freedom. He's not going to create a world where people are forced to do what he wants, because that's not real love. And he can only see this one possible way, or maybe there's a couple good possible ways, within the framework itself. But he only sees this narrow gap of ways that would get through, and it does involve a lot of people rejecting him. So we need to take that into consideration, that once again, we're not omniscient. We don't know the perspective that God has. What we do know is that he loves us. He died for us. He was willing to show how much he loves us on the cross, and that we can trust him because of that. And so we need to take that into consideration when dealing with objections like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. I've thought for quite some time that Plantinga's free will defense more or less showed that that's not really a good objection. There's a lot of assumptions cloaked in that need to be brought out, where I think you could probably say that in the broadest logically possible sense, God could create a world where everybody does come to him, but it's probably not a feasible world. And so the distinction there, I've heard somebody explain it like this: a possible world is anything that's logically coherent, anything where there's no inherent contradiction that's certain. Whereas there's all kinds of possible worlds that simply aren't feasible, meaning they just won't happen. Like, I don't think there's any possible world where, say, President Trump gives his next press conference where he's standing on his head the whole time, even though that's logically possible. It just couldn't happen.
Right. I completely agree with what you're saying there, yeah.
Yeah. And so it would seem to me that things like God creating a world where no one rejects him is probably logically possible in that broad sense, but certainly not feasible. I just don't see how it could actually work.
Exactly. And we have to remember we're dealing with an omniscient God who knows the best of all possible worlds.
Okay. Well, fantastic. That's probably about the end of what I've got on those videos, but just another question for fun. What do you think is the best argument for God's existence, and what do you think is the best argument against his existence?
Well, I think the best argument against his existence is the problem of evil. I think that's the only serious one that we really need to take into consideration. So I'll be dealing with that in my next video. Okay. I think the best argument now, I would say my favorite argument is the digital physics argument. It's a new argument we've been working on. And if you check out a video on my channel called The Emergent Universe, it covers a lot of the data that kind of goes into this. And it gets beyond simple contingency arguments, where we can actually show the most likely explanation for the universe would be a mind, because we can connect it to things like quantum cognition or parallels to the cosmic network of galaxies and the way the brain is. So we can make these sorts of connections and show the most likely explanation of the universe as a mind. So that's probably my favorite argument right now.
Okay. Did you put that video out a couple of years ago? I think I remember watching it.
Well, yeah, it's like a 3-part series. So the first video is the digital physics argument. Then I did a follow-up called A Universe from Nothing, Therefore God Exists. And then I just did the most recent video where I covered probably the best evidence for it in a video called The Emergent Universe. So I do have a lot of evidence for that.
Yeah, I found those very, very intriguing. Those were also tied to some of those research papers some physicists have done about how we may be living in a simulation, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Oh, correct. Yeah, and all the
Okay.
evidence seems to be pointing that the universe is some type of simulation.
Okay, yeah. I found that very interesting. I wouldn't say that I get the impression from your videos, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that you kind of lean more toward the idealist philosophical stance. Is that right?
Correct. I would call
Okay.
myself a theistic idealist.
Okay, yeah. And I'm not quite sure that I'm totally convinced of that, but it seems it's a very plausible and coherent position that I find intriguing. I tend to fall more into being like a moderate realist camp myself, and maybe we could talk about that in the future again sometime. But it's a very interesting approach that I like. A theistic idealist is definitely much, much stronger than many of the other idealistic variants going around, because if you just make God the source of many of the idealistic things, most of the problems with other types of idealism go right out the window.
Right.
Okay. Well, I guess that's all I've got for you. So thanks for coming on. Do you have any things you want to plug before we get off here?
Well, I mean, I think this will be airing after we recorded this, but I just did a debate with Ken Hovind on January 1st, where we argued, is evolution compatible with Christianity? So people can check that out. I posted it on my channel, where it's on Modern Day Debate channel. My video, Problem of Evil, should be out by now. I'm not sure. I got a lot more things to work with it. But yeah, I will start a series on Genesis next year, and I'll go through Genesis 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I got a lot of good things coming up on my channel I'm excited about.
Well, you're certainly not shying away from the controversial topics then. Good for you.
Nope, won't ever do that.
Okay, so, well, people can find Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy just by going to his, they can go to your YouTube channel, and you've got a Facebook group as well, right?
Yeah, Facebook page, and then a YouTube channel, Inspiring Philosophy, just same title.
Okay, fantastic. And if you go there and you like what he's doing, I'd suggest you support his work on Patreon. I do that myself because he's doing great work. So for people who go there and do that, just check that out. And, give me some feedback here. If you like the arguments Michael has given, let me know what you think. If you think he's off in some way, write in, let me know what you think. You can reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com, or you can look at our my Facebook group, The Examined Life with Phil. So thanks for listening, and we'll catch you again next week.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.